with threats that lead to a missing noble, a city now in ruin and a kingdom threatened to fall. The ideal to solve such incidents would be one of a dashing figure, one who displays unbridled heroism driven by an undying love and passion for his fellow people. So it would be no surprise the one to take up such a role is none other than Rance, a sex-crazed man-child, impulsive and egocentric to boot, driven by the hope of drawing the sword underneath his belt as opposed to the one attached to it. Rance has always been a series that has interested me. By ear, there has always seemed to be two greatly contrasting sides. One that made it seem like a crazy over-the-top fantasy nukige, and on the other fairly larger hand, genuine praise for its immaculate writing and world building. The reasons the name has carried such a strong legacy for 35 years now. The more this disparity was brought up, the more this odd sense of intrigue grew as how these two parts work together. And as of 2 months ago, I finally gave in to this curiosity. Having completed the remake of the first 2 games and the original third, it's safe to say I am now completely captivated and want to share my experience with it so far. The series of Rance follows the adventurer, Rance, taking on various quests for a living alongside his slave, Syl. The story of the two starts out fairly humble, being a search for a missing noble in O1, to saving a princess from a kingdom that has been conquered under an evil power. But no matter the circumstance, the biggest draw is Rance himself. Rance, as mentioned before, is far from the standard fantasy hero. In fact, redeeming qualities are so far buried beneath everything else they are hard to spot. You may think the jobs he sets out to do are honorable or for a good cause, but that is incredibly short-sighted. Behind every seemingly good act, before every face of kindness and sincerity he makes, lies an ulterior motive. And to Rance, consent is optional. Traversing various dungeons, he will blow any guys and monsters out of his path if it means he can get closer to a woman. Lust drives his body and cum through his blood, and as he mounts, unlimited sex indeed works. Outside of that, he is pretty much a child. He's impulsive, destroying the environment simply because he's bored, touching things he shouldn't, simply whatever can satisfy his hedonistic tendencies. Oh, let's not forget when he doesn't get his way is not below throwing a tantrum. Yes, he is so incredibly stubborn, he is willing to put a nation in jeopardy just because a woman wouldn't sleep with him. A hero brimming with undesirable qualities, and it's those things that are dialed up to the extreme, pairing perfectly with the self-aware writing to where most of what happens is comedic. Beautifully so. His confidence is unmatched, filled with so much pride that he would even admonish the sun for being a hindrance to him. In a weird way, being so unabashed in his flagrant ways, fully aware of who he is and determined in what he wants, exudes a very odd charisma. It also helps that the idea of consequence, as long as it doesn't pertain to the main plot, is largely non-existent for all parties involved. Well, except for men. Men be damned in the presence of Rance, as he gives nary a single care, sparing not a single iota of sympathy or empathy for them. Poor British. The writing is self-aware in this mix of black and blue comedy, brimming with ribaldry at the forefront of these subjects. We know it's bad, the writers do too. It doesn't endorse Rance's forceful actions and instead constantly reinforces just how much of an asshole he is, and that's what makes him so funny. You may expect and know a punchline is coming, but you don't know how low he will steep to reach it. This sole factor has made not a single joke in my 30 or so hours put into the first 3 games feel stale or out of place. If he was a real person, no doubt he would be the face for ire, but because it is completely enveloped in this fantasy, so far detached from everything And with a little tweaking of framing, Rance is much more prone to evoke laughter rather than disgust and hatred. I've seen him compared to a Greek hero, and that is pretty accurate, in more ways than one. With his crudeness, it's very understandable how off-putting he can sound, especially being at the forefront of everything. But no matter what words I say or how I string them together, nothing can quite put into perspective how likable he is in his unlikability. And one of those factors is when he stands in the hero spotlight, making it difficult to tell if there's some underlying heroism he wants to uphold, or if his self-righteousness and the general rectitude just happen to coincide. Right now though, it mostly seems like the latter. Even more hilarious is that these particular traits are part of the reason things somehow work out for him in the end, which is actually one of the more interesting things about him. His methods may not always be the most noble, nor underlying intentions the most upstanding, but he is fairly competent at getting things done, even if those same aspects hold him back. But that all depends on us, taking control of how we can interact with the environment and the people within. Of course, as each place is explored, there are various characters to be met who, for besides the really high energy but chill soundtrack, uphold the lively and energetic atmosphere. The choice in Rance's actions not only help you feel more involved with the main plot, but give more rounded characterization. Whether it's the girls trying to avoid Rance's advances, or a guy taking on his scrutiny, comedy will ensue either way. For the relatively short lengths of these games, a good majority of the characters play a good enough role with clearly defined personalities to the point that in spite of only appearing once or twice, turned out to be pretty memorable. Any future appearance of theirs was a joy of its own, just that small excitement of, I know you, sort of thing. Though this was mostly a thing in 01, even the shopkeepers you visit have their attitude towards Rance slowly develop throughout the course of the game. There really hasn't been any meaningful character arcs in development, nothing heart-gripping or the like, yet anyway. But man, do they make for a fun cast. Seeing the small changes in them through each game is pretty nice, like with Leah, Kanami, and Maria to name a few. It's the seamless blend of these quirks and personalities that hit you at a steady pace that make the game just a blast to play through. All of them have their own unique ways to interact with Rance that can really test his determination at times, but also, even in the smallest of ways, often lay out small building blocks of the world with each meeting. It helps that you're actively encouraged to talk to them, trying out different options, sometimes multiple times, to get hints of what to do next in the main quest. This really blends the strengths of the dialogue and these characters into the story no matter the relevance they have to the plot at hand. And given that Rance is more so an RPG than a visual novel series, the gameplay puts the investigation into action. Though each game has slight alterations, the core is that of a dungeon crawler with turn-based combat. 01 was by far way more fun than I would have thought with its gambling theme. The areas of the dungeons are represented by cards. Those cards can be progression points, rooms, chests, traps, which can get very annoying, or enemies. Then those enemies can be taken out with chips, which are weapons, shields, and single-use items. The first few parts of the game are pretty easy, but later, when inventory management becomes a huge part of the combat, it gets a lot more interesting. You see, it's not so simple as click an item to increase or reduce damage. As you acquire a more powerful arsenal to defeat more powerful enemies, it comes with a huge but simple caveat: cooldown times. As the enemies change their own attack and defense throughout the fight, uncertainty comes with every coming battle, forcing you to strategize in order to close that uncertain gap. Use up all your defenses and stronger enemies can one-shot you. Use up all your weapons and it won't be long until you start to lose the battle of attrition. It is such a unique take on the turn-based formula, which was why I was fairly disappointed with O2 that was fairly effortless and as simple as turn-based combat can get. All it is spamming one of the 2 attacks with the occasional heal, then once you get the best armor and sword, it gets even easier. 3 is somewhat the same in difficulty, but does spice it up with a top-down battleground simulator, where Rance's party is against various enemies moving around an arena. It's rather fun at first, but because it never feels challenging, especially if you grab the item that allows Phyllis to always fight, it falls into tedium later on, especially right at the end of the game with these statues you can't run from. The thing is, it's a bit unfair to compare the gameplay side of things as each game has their own circumstances. From what I've read, O1 is more of a proper remake while O2 is simply a graphical improvement with fitting script tweaks. And while the remake of 3 is more in line with O1 in its improvements, it's not yet translated, so I went with the original. Regardless of the game, however, the simple RPG mechanics have so much personality due to how they are neatly woven into the world. For example, the leveling gods and goddesses, who convert a character's experience into levels, with XP being a recognized currency, leading to Rance looking at enemies as stacks of XP, in a weird way kind of connecting us to Rance at how we perceive enemies. Actually, after writing this line, a thought came to mind. Is Rance, the series, perhaps a commentary of how the player, when knowingly engaging in a set fantasy, has a tendency to cut off emotions to seek out that fantasy? And the character Rance is simply a reflection of the semi-sociopathic state from a perspective of both the player and characters of the world? That could be why there are hardly any consequences, because if there was, it would go against the desired fantasy. The female characters always seem to work their way back in with future appearances, while any male characters, whether or not they carry a name, can be soon forgotten or outright killed without remorse. I may be thinking a bit too deeply into this, but either way, I think with a bit more thought and research, that could be an interesting topic to dive into. Nevertheless, there are a lot of lines, subtle and obvious, that work as both fourth wall breaking gags, genuine characterization, and world building. I do enjoy that type of humor, so seeing them peep up every now and then made for a good time. But the comedic aspect surprisingly doesn't drown out the fairly complex and interesting world these growing conflicts and mysteries take place in. The first 2 games are rather subtle about it, and it's not until the third where things start getting more pronounced. Like in the first game, there is a newspaper you can read that gives small lore tidbits about the world, political tensions, world events and the like, with one of these actually foreshadowing the plot of the third game, which, because it takes things to a more international scale, actually brings in a lot more working gears. Right now, it's pretty basic stuff. But again, and I cannot stress this enough, more than makes up for it with its strong, unique sense of identity. Every piece of this world, no matter how tropey or parody-like, feels also coherent and in line, as all of it is tied together so perfectly by none other than Rance himself. After all, that's why a good portion of this video was just on him, stringing us along his adventures with his questionable acts, to make for one of the most consistently funny and smile-worthy games out there. For a series as acclaimed as Rance, it's easy to get caught up in expectations, believing the highs of the later games can be seen as a journey begins. It wouldn't be wrong to say I don't believe those heights have been reached, and I didn't expect them to. In fact, the fact that I ended up enjoying these games way more than I thought I would have makes me so hopeful for the future. Rance 3 is the perfect example of this, as coming from the remakes, I was a bit worried I wouldn't get into it. Maybe the gameplay would be a chore. What if the writing isn't up to modern standards? So shrinking expectations, I was pleasantly surprised for it to be my favorite game so far. A true testament to how strong that Rance charm is. The comedy had me laughing for a good amount of time throughout the game, and thanks to the grander scale, added some really nice substance to not only further establish parts of the world, but let us actually see some development in the cast, new and old. One of my favorite parts was seeing Rance take up a leadership position, showing off the charisma and competence that hides under his normal behavior. Well, for the most part. I'm sure he was very thankful that the Laezis Liberation Army didn't have an HR department. Not to mention the really dumb yet all too fitting ending. It really is a masterpiece in that regard. What's especially great is even with just these 3 games, whenever I think back, a smile rises to my face. Usually accompanied by my glorious days getting stuck in my head for the rest of the day. When I finished 3, I wanted to go straight into 4, although I decided to hold back until this video releases. I don't know where this road will lead or even how long it will get, but I'm here to see it through to the end. Cause man, I know I've said it a lot, but there is so much heart in just these 3 games that I completely believe it earns its reputation. If not, already lives up to it, as this is just the foundation. The trail that leads to numerous peaks. I do wonder if Rance will start to mature throughout the games, and just exactly how the gears will continue to turn in this world. Again and again, I've heard the world building is one of Rance's greatest aspects, so I'm excited to see how this world will evolve. I'm thinking of updating my thoughts after I conclude the retro timeline with Kichikuo Rance, but until then, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching. Later.